Hi, I'm Mr. New Jersey. 1 week from now, on Tuesday, November 6th, 2018, Americans will head to the polls to vote in our midterm elections. In the great state of New Jersey, one of our 2 U.S. Senate seats is up for an election. Incumbent Democratic Senator Robert Menendez, who usually just goes by Bob Menendez, is running for re-election. His Republican opponent is Robert Hugin, who usually just goes by Bob Hugin. Normally, because New Jersey is a heavily blue state, this election would be a landslide cakewalk for the Democratic candidate. But some unusual circumstances have made the race more competitive than one would expect, making Republicans wonder if they can somehow pick up a seat in one of the most democratic states in the country. My analysis and prediction for this race will be the focus of this video. First, some brief background on the candidates. In an absolutely shocking coincidence, both of the candidates in this race have the same first name, use the same nickname, and grew up in the same North Jersey city, Union City in Hudson County. The city is one of the most densely populated places in New Jersey and the United States as a whole, just a stone's throw from Manhattan in New York City. In fact, both candidates have run ads talking about their Union City upbringings. Bob Menendez has spent a long career in politics at virtually every level of government. He has served as a member of the Union City School Board, as Union City's mayor, as a member of the New Jersey General Assembly, a member of the New Jersey Senate, and as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. Finally, in 2006, Menendez was appointed by Governor John Corzine to finish out the unexpired term of a U.S. Senate seat which had become vacant. Menendez was elected to his first full term in the Senate later that year, and he was re-elected in 2012. Menendez quickly rose through the ranks of the Senate, even spending 2 years as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Menendez is currently running for his 3rd full term in the Senate. Policy-wise, one of the most important issues to him is immigration. Both of his parents were immigrants from Cuba, so he has worked on the issue a lot. He was part of the bipartisan group of senators called the Gang of Eight, which put forth an immigration reform compromise that both strengthened border security and provided a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. But the bill did not pass out of Congress. Another key component of Menendez's campaign is opposition to many of the items on President Donald Trump's agenda. Menendez opposed the Republican attempts to repeal Obamacare, and he opposed the Republican tax plan that passed near the end of 2017. Now let's turn to Bob Hugin. Hugin has never held elected office before. Instead, after graduating from Princeton University, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps. After serving as a Marine for a number of years, Hugin launched a private sector business career. He has worked at several businesses, most prominently as CEO of Celgene Corporation, a large biotech company which makes and sells drugs to treat diseases like cancer. Politically, Hugin is generally conservative on more economic and regulatory issues, but he's more liberal on social issues. For instance, he is pro-choice, pro-gay marriage, and wants to have a path to citizenship for DACA recipients. With the candidate bios out of the way, let's discuss why this election is closer than most federal elections get in New Jersey. The basic reason this race got competitive is that Senator Menendez went on trial for corruption last year. He was charged by the U.S. Department of Justice with corruption, bribery, and failing to report gifts he received to the Senate. All of the charges against Menendez were related to his relationship with Florida ophthalmologist Solomon Melgen. The Department of Justice essentially alleged that Menendez received various gifts from Melgen, such as flights on a private jet and stays in luxury hotels, and that in exchange Menendez advanced Melgen's personal and business interests before government agencies. At his trial, Menendez didn't dispute that he received the gifts or that he helped Melgen out in some matters. Instead, he argued that the gifts were a result of his longtime friendship with Melgen rather than bribes, that the gifts did not fall under the category of things which Senate ethics rules required him to report, and that his advocacy for Melgen and government agencies was in keeping with his sincere policy beliefs regarding the matters Melgen was involved in. The trial ended with a hung jury, meaning the jurors couldn't reach a unanimous verdict on whether or not to convict Menendez. The judge declared a mistrial. A few months later, prosecutors announced they would drop the charges rather than try the case again. The end of the trial freed up Menendez to start running for re-election. Yet despite the fact that the criminal proceedings did not convict Menendez, the bipartisan Senate Ethics Committee did its own evaluation of his actions. The committee sent a unanimous letter to Menendez severely admonishing him, saying that his actions violated Senate ethics rules and that he should have known better than to take them. The committee also fined Menendez the market value of the gifts he received from Melgen. The whole ordeal of the trial and the Senate Ethics Committee letter substantially damaged Menendez's reputation in the state, to the point that his disapproval rating is actually higher than his approval rating among New Jerseyans. I'll leave it up to each of you to draw your own conclusions about Menendez's trial and the accusations against him. I only discussed the trial to explain, in a nutshell, why this election got competitive. Now, I have seen a whole bunch of analyses of this race, which try to boil it down to saying that voters are making a choice between an unethical Democrat and an ethical Republican. I fundamentally disagree with this assessment of the race, because as someone who has actually been on the ground in New Jersey talking with voters about how they view the race, I know that's not the analysis a lot of them are making. Some New Jerseyans do view it that way, but not nearly everyone. For instance, some voters agree with the perspective Menendez presented during his trial, and don't view Menendez's actions as corruption. Several people I've spoken to think Menendez just got a bit careless with not reporting gifts, and that this created a bad perception, but that otherwise what Menendez did wasn't all that bad. Another way some voters I've spoken to view this race is that it is a contest between an unethical Democrat and an unethical Republican. Wait, an unethical Republican? I can hear you asking. What has Bob Hugin done wrong? Well, Hugin actually has his own string of ethics-related allegations against him. Again, I won't tell you how to feel about these allegations, and I will leave you to come to your own conclusions. But I will briefly summarize the allegations and Hugin's responses to them here, just as I did with the allegations against Menendez. For one, while leading one of Princeton University's all-male eating clubs a few decades ago, Hugin unsuccessfully fought efforts to allow women to join the clubs. The dispute even went up to the New Jersey Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of the women. The incident has led critics to say that Hugin is a sexist. Hugin's response is essentially that it was a long time ago, that his views have since changed, and that he now realizes he was wrong. The next allegation against Hugin is that, as CEO of Celgene, he price-gouged cancer patients. During Hugin's time there, the company repeatedly raised the price of its main cancer drug, Revlimid, to the point where it cost over $16,000 for a month's supply of pills. The company also reportedly lobbied against legislation to lower drug prices, and prevented generic drug companies from sampling Celgene drugs to make their own cheaper versions, a practice drug companies are legally supposed to do. Hugin's response to the price gouging allegations is that raising prices was necessary to protect the financial health of the company and keep it viable. After all, developing pharmaceuticals is very expensive, and Celgene has experienced major financial difficulties over the years. Hugin also defends his record by pointing to a program that helped lower-income people get the drug at lower prices. Another big string of allegations against Hugin involves a whistleblower lawsuit that Celgene settled for $280 million. The lawsuit claimed that Celgene had falsely marketed its drugs for purposes the drugs were not approved for by the FDA, and that Celgene had defrauded Medicare and various state healthcare programs. The money Celgene paid to settle the suit went mostly to the federal government, with lesser amounts going to the states involved in the dispute. Hugin's response to these allegations are that they are simply untrue, and that the only reason Celgene settled the case was to avoid a lengthy trial which would have troubled investors. A final ethical allegation against Hugin involves his conduct during the campaign, in that one of his lines of attack against Menendez has been resurfacing widely debunked accusations from years ago that Menendez slept with child prostitutes in the Dominican Republic. Many have pointed to this example to argue that Hugin is willing to make disgusting lies to get votes, but Hugin argues that the allegations of prostitution are still credible and that voters should have as much information as possible when making their decisions. That's the last of the major allegations against Hugin. Again, draw your own conclusions about whether or not they are fair. Now, let's return to our discussion of the many perspectives New Jersey voters have on this race. The last perspective we need to cover is that when many voters think of this race, all they see is Donald Trump. Yup, President Trump is deeply, deeply unpopular in New Jersey. Polls consistently show President Trump as one of the only political figures with a higher disapproval rating among New Jerseyans than Senator Menendez. This is probably the single most common perspective on New Jersey's Senate race that I've heard when talking to voters. A whole lot of voters in New Jersey, mostly Democrats, but also a decent chunk of independents and a handful of Republicans, view President Trump as unethical and unhinged, as someone who wants to take away their health care, and as someone who doesn't take seriously enough Russia's attempts to influence the 2016 election. As usual, draw your own conclusions on whether that assessment is fair or not, but it is certainly what a large portion of New Jersey's population believes. Thus, even some of the voters I have spoken to who do consider Senator Menendez bad on ethics have told me that they plan to vote for him anyway because they think President Trump is even worse, and they don't want President Trump's agenda or nominees to get another vote in the Senate. Menendez has worked hard to brand Bob Hugin as a Trump Republican. Hugin was a Trump delegate at the 2016 Republican National Convention, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to support Trump's campaign, and even served as finance chair for the Trump campaign in New Jersey. However, Hugin has fought back against the label by arguing that he is instead an independent Republican who is willing to work with both sides. He points to his pro-choice views, support for a path to citizenship for DACA recipients, and support for gay marriage as examples of areas where he breaks with the Republican line. So, those are the major perspectives New Jersey voters have on the race that I am aware of. To recap, some see it as a normal election with an ethical Democrat versus an ethical Republican. Some see it as an unethical Democrat versus an ethical Republican. Some see it as an unethical Democrat versus an unethical Republican. And some see it merely as a vote for or against President Trump. This Senate race has been among the most negative political campaigns I have ever seen. Both sides have absolutely flooded the airwaves with millions of dollars in attack ads, and I think most voters just want the race to end. Much to their enjoyment, the race will end in just 1 week, which brings me at long last to my prediction. Who will win this Senate race? When I factor in how blue New Jersey tends to be in federal elections, how ethical allegations against Bob Hugin have somewhat canceled out the ethical allegations against Menendez in the minds of voters, how President Trump is sucking so much air out of the race, and how this year is expected to be a political climate favorable to Democrats, there's only one fair conclusion I can draw. I do predict that Robert Menendez, incumbent senior senator from the state of New Jersey, will be re-elected to his third full term in the United States Senate. There are just too many cards stacked against the Republicans to put the race into their column this year. If the GOP wanted to win this race, they really needed the narrative of an unethical Democrat versus an ethical Republican to become the dominant narrative guiding voters, but that simply hasn't happened. Polling has shown that although some traditionally Democratic voters have adopted that perspective, not enough have done so to overcome the large Democratic advantage in the state. I would like to say, though, that if there was a Democratic president at the moment rather than a Republican, I really could see the state flipping to the GOP this time. That's because two of the main factors that influenced my prediction here would be different if there was a Democratic president. The first is, there would be elevated Republican turnout and a possible red wave coming, since the president's party tends to lose seats in the midterms. And secondly, there wouldn't be a narrative in the race about voters being afraid of giving an extra vote to a really unpopular Republican president. Thus, there would be less competition to the narrative of an unethical Democrat versus an ethical Republican, and more people might adopt that perspective when voting. So, if it was a different president and a different national political climate, yes, maybe the GOP could have pulled this race out. But the way things are actually going doesn't make that seem likely. However, even though I'm predicting a Bob Menendez victory, polling does currently show this race as being much closer than statewide federal elections in New Jersey typically are. Democrats usually win the state by double digits. For example, Hillary Clinton won it by about 14% in 2016, and President Obama won it by 18% in 2012. As of the making of this video, the Real Clear Politics polling average shows Senator Menendez leading by just single digits, specifically by 6.5%. Despite a smaller than usual lead, it's important to note two things. Firstly, I'm not aware of a single poll this election cycle that showed Bob Hugin ahead, though some did put him within the margin of error. And for all of the really close polls I've seen another poll that shows Menendez way ahead, sometimes even by double digits. So I think the most logical conclusion is that the polls on either extreme are the outliers, and that Menendez's true lead probably is somewhere in the middle to upper half of single digits, like the polling average suggests. Secondly, I went back and looked at the Real Clear Politics averages for past statewide elections in New Jersey, and I didn't see a noticeable trend of the average underestimating Republicans. Most of the time, the average was just within a few points of the final result, not enough to actually change the outcome of the race. The one noticeable example I found where their average was substantially off was the 2012 presidential election, when it actually underestimated Democratic President Barack Obama by about 6%. So, yes, the average could theoretically, maybe, possibly be off by enough to tip the election to Hugin, but it's simply highly unlikely, and it's equally plausible that the average is underestimating Menendez rather than Hugin. At this point in the video, most election predictors would sign off and call it a day, but those who have watched my gubernatorial election prediction last year know that I like to up the ante one extra step by trying to predict how each of New Jersey's 21 counties will vote, rather than just predicting the statewide result. So, I guess it's time to get started on that front. Unfortunately, county-by-county polling isn't conducted for statewide races, so all I can do is take the statewide polling data and try to extrapolate it to the counties based on their particular voting trends and dynamics. Let's start by looking at some recent statewide election maps for a sense of New Jersey's counties. Up first is the most recent statewide election we've had, the gubernatorial election in 2017, when New Jersey elected Phil Murphy to the state's top job. This is the best example of what I would consider the baseline map of New Jersey politics in the present day. In other words, if you told me there would be a statewide election, but gave me absolutely no information about who was running, what the position being voted on was, or what the political environment was like, this is probably the prediction map I would hand back to you, representing the general political lean of each county. Phil Murphy won nearly all of the counties along the New Jersey Turnpike, which runs between the predominantly Democratic New York and Philadelphia metropolitan areas. Murphy also won a handful of other counties around the state. Now, let's take a look at Menendez's previous election in 2012, when he shared the ballot with President Obama. This was long before the ethics allegations against Menendez surfaced, so he was still a pretty popular figure in the state. And President Obama was highly popular here too, so Democratic momentum was very strong. Menendez won by a margin of almost 20%, carrying all but the 7 most Republican counties in the state. He pretty much won every county you could consider a swing county, including Salem County in South Jersey and Somerset County in Central Jersey. Now, we turn to 2016. This was a slightly Republican-leaning political environment nationally, and just like how Donald Trump pulled off a string of upset victories in the Midwest by connecting to the white working class, he also pulled off an upset victory by a margin of 1% in typically blue Gloucester County. I think the dynamics that drove Trump's Midwestern wins were also what propelled him forward in Gloucester County. Southwest Jersey bears a lot of similarities to the Midwestern U.S., with a substantial population of struggling working-class voters. It was interesting to watch the 2016 election in New Jersey, because Hillary Clinton did worse than Democrats typically do in working-class South Jersey, but did better than Democrats typically do in wealthier, traditionally Republican Central Jersey counties like Hunterdon and Morris. Even the Central Jersey swing county of Somerset, which had voted against Senator Cory Booker just 2 years prior, went for Clinton by more than 10% this time, largely because President Trump didn't appeal much to voters there. I hope those maps effectively set up the landscape we're going to be talking about today. I wanted to come up with statistical models to help guide my predictions, rather than relying solely on value judgments, and I came up with several different options. Here are the options I created, though I know they aren't even close to perfect. The first pulls together New Jersey's 3 most recent statewide elections: 2017 gubernatorial, 2016 presidential, and 2014 U.S. Senate elections, to get a sense of how much redder or bluer the counties usually are compared to the statewide margin. I didn't want to go back farther than 3 elections to avoid factoring out demographic shifts that may have happened in recent years. I also made the decision to double weight the 2016 election in this model, because President Trump is, more or less, on the ballot in both that race and in this one. So I figured how each county feels about President Trump should have more of an effect on the model than how each county felt about, for instance, Phil Murphy or Cory Booker. Thus, I averaged the margins in each county in those past 3 elections, including counting 2016 twice, to get a generic party lean for each county, as well as a statewide lean. The statewide lean ended up being 13.95% in favor of the Democrats. Then, because Menendez is underperforming that 13.95% margin by 7.45%, I lowered the Democratic margin in each county by 7.45%. The point of this exercise is to gauge, in basic terms, if Menendez is getting 6.5% in New Jersey as a whole, according to the polling average, How much would we expect him to get in each county if his margins in each county lowered uniformly by the same amount that the statewide result lowered? You can see the results of this model on screen. It has Menendez winning in most of the traditionally Democratic counties, and Hugin leading in most of the traditionally Republican and swing counties. For instance, both Somerset County and Gloucester County go to Bob Hugin using this model. But it's interesting to note the different reasons the model has for each of those counties going to Hugin. Somerset County goes narrowly red because, despite its dislike of President Trump, the other two elections included in the model bring out its historically moderate and swing tendencies. A typically purple swing county in a year where the Democrat does worse than is typical could reasonably be expected to go red. By contrast, the model shows Gloucester County going red for other reasons. Despite the county's usual Democratic history, it comes up red here largely because it voted for President Trump. I think it's safe to assume that the types of counties least likely to subscribe to the idea of voting for Menendez to stop Trump would be counties that voted for Trump in the first place. Before moving on to the second model I made, I also want to point out some other counties that the model shows being pretty competitive. Atlantic and Cumberland counties, both in South Jersey, voted for the Democrat in all three of the elections included in the model, yet they did so by small enough margins that if Menendez underperforms the Democratic norm by about 7%, like the polling suggests he will, these counties might flip to the GOP as well. The model shows Hugin just barely losing both of them. Of course, the biggest criticism of this first model overall is that it isn't safe to assume Menendez's margins will fall uniformly across the state. So some of the other factors we'll be talking about later might try to correct for that somewhat. The second model I made is based on digging deeper into the polling of the race. Several polls of the race examine how well each candidate is doing with members of each party and with independents. So, I took a look at one of the most recent polls by Rutgers-Eagleton and found the following. The poll shows Menendez ahead statewide by 5%. Looking deeper, you can see that Menendez has lost more Democrats than Hugin has lost Republicans. Among Democrats, 85% plan to vote for Menendez, while 9% plan to vote for Hugin. Among Republicans, 94% plan to vote for Hugin, while just 5% plan to vote for Menendez. Lastly, Hugin has a minor lead among independents. 46% of independents plan to vote for Hugin, compared with 41% for Menendez. Thus, I took a look at an NJ.com article from earlier this year, discussing how many registered Democrats, Republicans, and unaffiliated voters are registered in each of New Jersey's 21 counties. Then, I took the percentages from the poll and applied them in each county. It is far from a stalwart model, of course, the biggest reason being that a lot of the registered voters might not actually turn out to vote. But the model does provide a general sense of how party affiliation and the number of independents in each county may impact the county-by-county voting. All but one of the counties goes to the same party using this model as the other model. The lone exception is Gloucester County, which this model shows going to the Democrats. Now that two unrelated models have independently reached the same conclusion for most counties, I'm starting to get a decent sense of what the map could look like. The last thing I have to look at to make my decision is primary data. So far, I would say the four closest counties in the examination have been Atlantic, Cumberland, Gloucester, and Somerset, so those are the counties we'll focus on using the primary data. I pulled these vote totals for the primary from the New Jersey Department of State's website, and calculated the vote percentages and margins using those. Starting with Somerset, we can see that this was one of Bob Menendez's worst counties, and one of Bob Hugin's best counties. In fact, Menendez narrowly lost Somerset County to primary challenger Lisa McCormick. So this signals to me that there are a lot of Democrats in this county unhappy with Menendez who are potential defections. It backs up what the other two models have already predicted, a Republican win. Now, let's turn to Gloucester. Bob Hugin did so-so in Gloucester County, getting about 75% of the vote, but Bob Menendez did very poorly there, and he was only about 1/5% away from losing it to McCormick. So, again, it seems the county has lots of potential for Democratic defections. This has inclined me to trust the first model, which shows Gloucester going to Hugin. Now, let's turn to Atlantic and Cumberland counties. Both models showed Menendez carrying both of the counties, but not by much. So let's see what the primary data here has to say, and if I should second-guess the model's conclusions. Well, in Atlantic County, the primary results seem to support the models. Menendez actually overperformed his statewide primary result here, while Hugin underperformed his statewide margin in it. In fact, it is one of the few counties in the state that Menendez won by a higher margin in the Democratic primary than Hugin did in the Republican primary. So this has helped me shore up my decision to put Atlantic County in the Bob Menendez column. Finally, Cumberland County. Both candidates underperformed their statewide primary margins here. Hugin got roughly 71% of its primary vote, and Menendez got about 54%. Overall, I'd say that's slightly better news for Hugin, but not by enough to make me follow the primary results rather than the models. I'm going to put this county in the Bob Menendez column. So, that is my final prediction for New Jersey's 2018 U.S. Senate race. Bob Menendez wins statewide, carrying Bergen, Passaic, Hudson, Essex, Union, Middlesex, Mercer, Burlington, Camden, Atlantic, and Cumberland counties. Bob Hugin continues the long-standing Republican tradition of losing U.S. Senate races in New Jersey, but he gets closer than usual, carrying the typically red counties such as Sussex, Warren, Morris, Hunterdon, Monmouth, Ocean, and Cape May, along with the swing counties of Somerset, Gloucester, and Salem. I want to say, though, that my confidence level for a lot of the closer counties is very low. I know the models are flawed, but they're all I could do with the very limited time I had. I have one last thing to say before signing off, which is, please go vote. There is so much to vote on in New Jersey that this is a very important election. There's, of course, the U.S. Senate race we were just discussing, and in addition, every member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election. We have a statewide bond referendum to vote on regarding whether or not we'll allow the state to sell bonds to raise money for improving our state's schools. And depending on where you live, there may be elections for local offices ranging from school board to city council to your mayor to county elected officials, and some places even have special state legislative elections for legislative seats whose members left partway through the session. So there's a lot to vote on. Please go vote. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Mr. New Jersey YouTube channel, and hit the notification bell to be notified when I release new content. Happy voting, and I'll see you next time.